Whether you're a student cramming for your developmental psych final, preparing for the AP exam, or just someone who's wondered why toddlers think differently than teenagers, you've come to the right place. In today's video, we're covering 75 developmental psychology terms every student must know. We're going to define each term, walk through a clear example, and explain it in a way that's easy to understand and remember. By the end of this video, you'll understand how humans develop from conception through old age, and the biology of prenatal development, Piaget's theory of how kids learn to think, Erikson's 8 stages of psychosocial growth across the entire lifespan, Vygotsky's theory of learning through culture and social interaction, and the key changes that define adolescence, adulthood, and aging. This is the ultimate study guide for developmental psychology. Be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss a single part of this series. And remember, you can get the exact slides and flashcards used in this video by going to thepsychologynotebook.com for free resources and fun accessories for your psychology notebook. All right, let's begin. Section 1, Prenatal Development, terms 1 through 11. Before we can talk about childhood or adolescence, we need to go back to the period before birth. These first terms will help you keep the stages of prenatal development straight and understand why timing matters so much. 1. Prenatal development. This is the entire process of growth between conception and birth. Psychologists usually divide it into 3 periods: germinal, embryonic, and fetal. You may also hear medical professionals discuss pregnancy in trimesters. The systems are a little different, but both help us keep track of important milestones and risks before birth. 2. Germinal period. The germinal period comes first and lasts from conception until implantation, roughly the first 2 weeks. During this brief period, the fertilized egg is already dividing rapidly into a cluster of cells, even before it attaches to the uterine wall. 3. Embryonic period. Next is the embryonic period. From about weeks 2 through week 8, this is when the major organs and basic body structures begin to form. The heart starts beating, limb buds appear, and because so much is being built at once, this is an especially sensitive time for structural birth defects. 4. Fetal period. The fetal period begins around week 9 and continues until birth. It is the third and longest period. By this point, the major organs and structures already exist. Now, the focus shifts towards growth, refinement, and maturation. 5. Teratogen. A teratogen is an environmental agent that can interfere with prenatal development. This might be a drug, a virus, or a chemical. Alcohol, certain medications, and the rubella virus are all examples. But remember, exposure does not produce the same outcome in every case. The timing and dose matter. 6. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, or FASD, is the umbrella term for the range of physical, behavioral, and cognitive effects caused by prenatal alcohol exposure. A simple example is this. A child with FASD might show characteristic facial features alongside neurodevelopmental effects like difficulty with intention or impulse control, with severity varying case by case. 7. Critical period. A critical period is a narrow window when a particular structure is developing and is especially vulnerable to harm. An example is limb formation early in the embryonic period. Teratogen exposure during this window is much more likely to affect the limbs than the same exposure later in pregnancy. 8. Sensitive period. A sensitive period is broader and more flexible than a critical period. It is a time when a developing system is especially responsive to certain experiences, but learning can still happen later. For example, language. Young children tend to pick it up more easily, but adults can still learn a new language. 9. Genotype. Genotype is an organism's complete genetic makeup inherited from both parents. For example, a person's genotype includes their full genetic code for traits like eye color and even genes that never end up visibly expressed. Phenotype. A phenotype is the observable physical, behavioral, and biochemical characteristics that result from the interaction between a genotype and environment. For example, two people can share a genotype for height, but the one with better child nutrition may end up with a taller phenotype. 11. Epigenetics. Epigenetics is the study of how environmental factors and experiences can change gene expression without altering the underlying DNA sequence itself. In real life, chronic stress during pregnancy can epigenetically shift how a baby's stress response genes are expressed later in life without changing the genes themselves. So the prenatal section gives us an important theme to carry forward. Development is shaped by both biology and experience. So let's look at what happens as children begin thinking and making sense of the world. This brings us to Jean Piaget. Section 2. Piaget's stages of cognitive development, terms 12 to 22. Piaget's big idea was that children do not simply know less than adults. Their thinking works differently, and it changes in recognizable stages as they grow. 12. Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Piaget proposed that children move through 4 distinct stages of thinking, with each stage building on the abilities that came before it. In other words, a 3-year-old and a 12-year-old do not just know different facts. They reason about the world in different ways. 13. Schema. A schema is a mental framework we use to organize and interpret information. A toddler's first schema for dog, for instance, might be anything with 4 legs and fur. That works fairly well until the toddler meets a cat. 14. Assimilation. Assimilation happens when we fit new information into a schema we already have. So when a child sees a cat and calls it a doggy, the child is assimilating the cat into that existing dog schema. 15. Accommodation. Accommodation happens when the old schema no longer works, so we revise it or create a new one. Once the child realizes cats and dogs are different animals, they build a separate cat schema. 16. Sensory motor stage. The sensory motor stage is Piaget's first stage, ranging from birth to about age 2, in which infants learn about the world through their senses and motor actions. Here's one way this might look. An infant who repeatedly drops a spoon from a high chair to watch what happens is exploring cause and effect through direct sensory motor experience. 17. Object permanence. Object permanence is the understanding that objects continue to exist even when they can't be seen, heard, or touched. This is developed during the sensory motor stage. A simple example is this. A baby who searches for a toy hidden under a blanket has developed object permanence, where earlier they would have acted as though it no longer existed. 18. Pre-operational stage. The pre-operational stage is Piaget's second stage, roughly ages 2 to 7, and it's marked by symbolic thinking but not yet logical reasoning. For example, a 4-year-old using a banana as a pretend telephone is demonstrated the symbolic thinking typical of this stage. 19. Egocentrism. In Piaget's theory, egocentrism is a young child's difficulty seeing a situation from any perspective other than their own, usually common during the pre-operational stage. For example, a pre-operational child covering their own eyes might genuinely believe that others can't see them either. 20. Conservation. Conservation is the understanding that a quantity stays the same even when its apparent changes, typically achieved during the concrete operational stage. A real-life example is a child who understands that water poured from a short wide glass into a tall thin one is still the same amount of water and has grasped conservation. 21. Concrete operational stage. The concrete operational stage is Piaget's third stage, roughly ages 7 to 11, and it's when children can reason logically about concrete physical situations. Here's one way this might look. A child in this stage can solve math problems using physical objects, but still struggles with fully abstract hypothetical reasoning. 22. Formal operational stage. The formal operational stage is Piaget's fourth and final stage, beginning around age 12, and it's marked by abstract, hypothetical, and systemic reasoning. A simple example is this. A teenager in the formal operational stage can debate abstract concepts like justice or reason through what-if scenarios they've never actually experienced. Piaget's stages explain how children's thinking develops, but they stop at adolescence. Erikson picked up where Piaget left off, building a theory that covers emotional and social development across the entire human lifespan from infancy all the way to old age. Section 3. Erikson Stages of Psychosocial Development, terms 23 to 33. Erikson proposed 8 stages, and each one is organized around a conflict. The word versus can make these sound like simple either-or choices, but that is not quite the point. Each conflict represents 2 sides of a developmental challenge that people work to balance. 23. Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. Erikson's theory proposes that people move through 8 stages across the lifespan, with each stage centered on a psychosocial conflict. The easiest distinction to remember is that Piaget focused mainly on how children's thinking changes, while Erikson followed social and emotional development all the way through late adulthood. 24. Trust versus mistrust. Trust versus mistrust is Erikson's first stage, and it ranges from birth to about 18 months, and it is centered on developing trust based on the reliability of caregivers. For example, an infant whose cries are consistently responded to develops basic trust that the world is safe and a dependable place. 25. Autonomy versus shame and doubt. Autonomy versus shame and doubt is Erikson's second stage, roughly 18 months to 3 years, and it's centered on developing independence versus feeling shame over one's own abilities. A real-life example is a toddler insisting on putting on their own shoes, even if they're on the wrong feet, is working through the autonomy side of this stage. 26. Initiative versus guilt. Initiative versus guilt is Erikson's third stage, roughly around ages 3 to 5, and it's centered on initiating activities versus feeling guilty for asserting too much control. Here is one way this might look. A preschooler who plans and leads a pretend game with friends is developing initiative. 27. Industry versus inferiority. Industry versus inferiority is Erikson's fourth stage, roughly around the ages 5 to 12. It's centered on developing competence through accomplishment versus feeling inferior. A simple example is this. A child who takes pride in mastering a new skill at school is resolving this stage toward industry. 28. Identity versus role confusion. Identity versus role confusion is Erikson's fifth stage, occurring during adolescence, and it's centered on forming a coherent sense of identity versus confusion about one's role. For example, a teenager trying out different friend groups and beliefs before settling into a sense of self is navigating identity versus role confusion. 29. Intimacy versus isolation. Intimacy versus isolation is Erikson's sixth stage, occurring in young adulthood, and it's centered on forming close, committed relationships versus emotional isolation. For example, a young adult who struggles to form a lasting partnership out of fear of vulnerability may be stuck on the isolation side of this stage. 30. Generativity versus stagnation. Generativity versus stagnation is Erikson's seventh stage, occurring in middle adulthood, and it's centered on contributing to the next generation versus feeling stagnant. In real life, an adult who mentors younger coworkers is expressing generativity, while others who feel their life has no lasting impact may experience stagnation. 31. Ego integrity versus despair. Ego integrity versus despair is Erikson's 8th and final stage, occurring in late adulthood, and it's centered on looking back on life with fulfillment versus regret. Here's one way this might look. An older adult who reflects on their life and feels it was meaningful, despite its imperfections, has achieved ego integrity. 32. Identity crisis. Identity crisis is Erikson's term for the period of intense identity exploration and questioning that typically occurs during adolescence. A simple example is this: a college student switching majors multiple times while questioning their career path and values is going through an identity crisis in Erikson's sense of the term. 33. Psychosocial moratorium. A psychosocial moratorium is a socially sanctioned time-out period, especially during adolescence and young adulthood, when a person can explore roles and identities without full adult responsibilities. For example, the college years often function as a psychosocial moratorium, giving young adults room to explore careers and beliefs before committing. Erikson's theory gives us the social and emotional side of development across the lifespan. Now we're returning to cognitive development, but with an important change in perspective. Remember, Piaget emphasized what children discover. Vygotsky emphasized what they learn with and through other people. Section 4. Vygotsky's Sociocultural theory, terms 34 through 42. As you listen to this section, notice how often support, language, culture, and collaboration appear. Those ideas sit at the center of Vygotsky's theory. 34. Vygotsky's Sociocultural theory. Vygotsky's sociocultural theory holds that cognitive development is fundamentally shaped by social interaction and cultural context, not just individual exploration. For example, unlike Piaget, Vygotsky argued a child's thinking develops largely through guided interaction with more skilled people around them. 35. Zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development, or ZPD, is the gap between what a learner can do independently and what they can do with guidance from someone more skilled. In real life, a child who can't solve a puzzle alone but succeeds with a parent's hints is working within their zone of proximal development. 36. Scaffolding. Scaffolding is the temporary support a more knowledgeable person provides to help a learner accomplish a task, and eventually withdraws as the learner's competence grows. Here's one way this might look. A teacher who solves half a math problem for a student, then only offers hints and eventually steps back entirely, is providing scaffolding. 37. More knowledgeable other. The more knowledgeable other, or MKO, is anyone with greater understanding or skill than the learner who helps guide their development, such as a parent, a teacher, or even a peer. A simple example is this: an older sibling teaching a younger one how to tie their shoes is acting as a more knowledgeable other. 38. Private speech. Private speech is the out-loud, self-directed talk young children use to guide their own thinking and behavior. For example, a child narrating, "Put the red block here, now the blue one," while building a tower is using private speech to organize their own actions. 39. Cultural tools. Cultural tools are the physical and symbolic tools a culture provides, like language, writing systems, and technology that shape how children learn to think and solve problems. For example, learning a culture's specific number system is learning to use a cultural tool that shapes all future mathematical thinking. Social constructivism. Social constructivism is the view that knowledge is actively built through social interaction and collaboration rather than absorbed individually. In real life, a classroom where students work in groups to arrive at an answer together reflects a social constructivist approach to learning. 41. Guided participation. Guided participation is the process by which children learn skills and cultural knowledge through structured, hands-on involvement with more experienced members of their community. Here's one way this might look. A child learning to cook by helping a parent measure and stir ingredients. With steadily increasing responsibility is engaging in guided participation. 42. Inner speech. Inner speech is the internalized, silent version of private speech that Vygotsky believed children eventually developed. It's used for private thought and self-guidance. A simple example is this. An adult silently talking themselves through stressful decisions is using inner speech. We've now covered 3 major theories of how kids grow and think. Erikson's 5th stage, identity versus role confusion, centers on adolescence. So let's zoom in on that stage of life and the specific vocabulary that describes what's happening in the teenage years. Section 5, Adolescence, terms 43 to 53. Adolescence includes rapid physical, cognitive, and social change. We will start with puberty, then move into identity, relationships, and the still developing adolescent brain. 43. Puberty. Puberty is the biological process of physical and sexual maturation that marks the transition from childhood to adolescence. It's triggered by hormonal changes. For example, puberty typically begins earlier in girls than boys, though the exact timing varies widely from person to person. 44. Primary sex characteristics. Primary sex characteristics are the reproductive organs and structures directly involved in the reproduction that mature during puberty. For example, maturation of the ovaries in girls and the testes in boys are both primary sex characteristics. 45. Secondary sex characteristics. Secondary sex characteristics are physical changes that emerge during puberty and signal sexual maturation without being directly involved in reproduction. In real life, the growth of facial hair in boys and breast development in girls are both secondary sex characteristics. 46. Storm and stress. Storm and stress is G. Stanley Hall's early 1990s view of adolescence as an inherently turbulent period marked by mood swings, conflict with parents, and risk-taking. His framing shaped a century of stereotypes about teenagers. Modern research, however, shows that adolescence turbulence varies far more across individuals and cultures than Hall's theory suggested. 47. Adolescence egocentrism. Adolescent egocentrism is a term coined by David Elkind, and it describes a heightened self-focus during the teen years that leads adolescents to feel uniquely observed and understood or misunderstood. A simple example is this. Adolescent egocentrism helps explain why a teenager might feel like everyone at school noticed a small mistake they made. 48. Imaginary audience. The imaginary audience is the belief, part of adolescent egocentrism, that one is constantly being watched and evaluated by others. For example, a teenager who refuses to wear a certain outfit because they're convinced everyone at school will judge them is responding to an imaginary audience. 49. Personal fable. The personal fable is the belief, also part of adolescent egocentrism, that one's own feelings and experiences are unique and that one is invulnerable to risks that affect other people. For example, a personal fable might lead a teenager to believe that risky behavior is dangerous for other people, but not true for them. 50. Identity statuses. Identity statuses developed by James Marcia are 4 categories describing when a person stands in identity development based on exploration and commitment. They are diffusion, foreclosure, moratorium, and achievement. In real life, a teen who simply adopted their parents' career expectations without ever questioning them is in a state of identity foreclosure, one of Marcia's 4 identity statuses. 51. Peer influence. Peer influence is the effect that friends and social groups have on an adolescent's attitudes, behavior, and decisions. Here is one way this might look. A teenager who starts dressing differently or picking up new hobbies after joining a new friend group is experiencing peer influence. 52. Parent-adolescent conflict. Parent-adolescent conflict is the increase in disagreement and friction between teens and parents, most common in early adolescence and typically centers on everyday issues rather than core values. A simple example is this. Conflict over curfews or chores is far more conflict than conflict over deeply held beliefs, which tend to stay aligned between teens and parents. 53. Adolescent brain development. Adolescent brain development refers to the ongoing maturation of the brain during the teenage years, especially the prefrontal cortex, which continues developing into a person's mid-20s. For example, this uneven development, where the brain's emotional centers mature faster than the prefrontal cortex that regulates them, helps explain why teens are capable of complex reasoning but still show more impulse, risk-taking behavior than adults. Adolescence eventually gives way to adulthood, and psychologists break that stretch of life into its own set of stages and milestones, from the 20s all the way to the 60s. Section 6. Adulthood, terms 54 to 64. Adulthood is not one uniform stage. Psychologists distinguish between emerging, young, middle, and late adulthood, and each period brings different developmental tasks. Keep in mind that these age ranges are useful guides, but they are not rigid deadlines everyone follows. 54. Emerging adulthood. Emerging adulthood is a term coined by Jeffrey Arnett, and it's described as a distinct developmental period roughly between the ages of 18 to 25, and it's marked by identity exploration, instability, and not yet feeling fully adult. For example, a 22-year-old switching jobs, living arrangements, and relationships while still figuring out their direction is a textbook example of emerging adulthood. 55. Young adulthood. Young adulthood is the developmental period roughly spanning the 20s through 30s, typically centered on establishing careers, relationships, and independence. In real life, young adulthood is often when people work through Erikson's stages of intimacy versus isolation and forming lasting partnerships. 56. Middle adulthood. Middle adulthood is the developmental period roughly spanning from ages 40 to 65. It's often centered on career, family, and generativity. Here is one way this might look. Someone in middle adulthood might shift focus toward mentoring younger colleagues or raising a family, reflecting Erikson's generativity versus stagnation stage. 57. Late adulthood. Late adulthood is the developmental period from roughly age 65 and onward, and it's often involving retirement, reflection, and the physical changes associated with aging. A simple example is this. Late adulthood is when many people confront Erikson's final stage, ego integrity versus despair, while looking back on the life that they have lived. 58. Midlife crisis. Midlife crisis is a term coined by psychoanalyst Elliot Jacques in 1965. It's described as a period of self-doubt and reassessment that some people experience around middle age. It's often triggered by an awareness of aging and mortality. For example, someone in a so-called midlife crisis might make a major sudden life change, like switching careers, though research suggests this experience is far less universal than pop culture depicts. 59. Generativity. Generativity is the sense of contributing to future generations through parenting, mentoring, or meaningful work. It's central to Erikson's middle adulthood stage. For example, a middle-aged adult who volunteers to coach a youth sports team is expressing generativity. 60. Empty nest syndrome. Empty nest syndrome describes the feeling of sadness, loss, or loneliness some parents experience after their children grow up and leave home. In real life, a parent who feels an unexpected sense of loss after driving their last child to college may be experiencing empty nest syndrome, though many parents instead report relief, or a renewed freedom. 61. Menopause. Menopause is the biological process typically occurring in a woman's late 40s to early 50s, marking the permanent end of a menstrual cycle and fertility. Here's one way this might look. Menopause is officially diagnosed after 12 consecutive months without a menstrual period, usually preceded by several years of hormonal fluctuation. 62. Andropause. Andropause is an informal and contested term sometimes used to describe the gradual decline in testosterone that some men experience with age. Unlike menopause, it has no clear endpoint for fertility, and it's not formally recognized as a distinct medical condition. 63. Crystallized intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is the accumulated knowledge, facts, and skills gained through education and experience, which tends to remain stable or even grow through most of adulthood. For example, a person's vocabulary and general knowledge, both forms of crystallized intelligence, often continue improving well into their 60s. 64. Fluid intelligence. Fluid intelligence is the capacity to reason and solve novel problems without relying on prior knowledge, which tends to peak in late 20s and gradually decline with age. For example, fluid intelligence is why younger adults often outperform older adults on brand new logic puzzles, even when the older adults have more accumulated general knowledge. That brings us to the final stretch of the lifespan, the terms psychologists use to describe how people age and what actually predicts whether someone ages well. Section 7. Aging, terms 65 to 75. This final section covers both the biology of aging and several competing ideas about what helps people age well. As we go, notice that aging is not presented as one simple path of decline. Context, health, relationships, activity, and lifelong experience all matter. 65. Senescence. Senescence is the biological process of aging, involving the gradual decline of cellular and physiological functions over time. In real life, senescence explains why wound healing and immune response both tend to slow down in older adults. 66. Ageism. Ageism is prejudice or discrimination against people based on their age. It's most commonly directed at older adults. Here's one way this might look. Assuming an older job applicant can't learn new technology without any evidence is a form of ageism. 67. Disengagement theory. Disengagement theory, proposed by Cumming and Henry, holds that it is natural and even beneficial for older adults to gradually withdraw from social roles and relationships. Under this theory, an older adult stepping back from community involvement would be viewed as a normal part of aging. Keep in mind, though, that this idea has been heavily criticized and largely rejected by later researchers. 68. Activity theory. Activity theory, developed by Robert Havengurst, proposes that older adults are most satisfied when they stay active and replace lost roles with new ones, directly countering disengagement theory. For example, activity theory would predict that a retiree who takes up new hobbies and social groups will report higher life satisfaction than one who withdraws. 69. Continuity theory. Continuity theory proposes that older adults age most successfully by maintaining consistent habits, relationships, and personality patterns from earlier in life, rather than either withdrawing or replacing old rules entirely. For example, continuity theory explains why someone who is always a homebody tends to stay one in retirement, while someone who's always social keeps prioritizing social activity. 70. Cognitive reserve. Cognitive reserve is the brain's ability to maintain function and resist noticeable decline despite age-related changes or damage, often built through education, mentally engaging activity, and social connection. In real life, two people with similar levels of brain aging can show very different symptoms if one has built up more cognitive reserve through a lifetime of mentally stimulating work or hobbies. 71. Dementia. Dementia is an umbrella term for a decline in cognitive function, including memory, reasoning, and communication that is severe enough to interfere with daily life. A common point of confusion is that dementia is not one specific disease. It is a category of symptoms that can result from several underlying conditions. 72. Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease is the most common cause of dementia, a progressive brain disease involving the buildup of abnormal protein deposits that gradually destroy neurons. A simple example is this. Alzheimer's disease typically begins with short-term memory problems before progressing to more severe cognitive and functional decline. 73. Successful aging. Successful aging is a model that emphasizes maintaining low disease risk, high physical and cognitive functioning, and active engagement with life. For example, someone who stays physically active, socially connected, and mentally engaged in their 80s is often cited as an example of successful aging. 74. Kubler-Ross stages of dying. The Kubler-Ross module, developed by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, describes 5 emotional responses to terminal illness or grief. They are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Here is the important part. These stages were never meant to be fixed or a universal sequence. So people may experience some of them, return to them, or not identify with them at all. And research does not show that everyone moves through them in the same order. 75. Life review. Life review is the process, often occurring in late adulthood, of reflecting back on one's life to find meaning and resolve unfinished business. It's closely related to Erikson's ego integrity versus despair stage. In real life, an older adult who spends time telling family stories and reflecting on major life decisions is engaging in a life review. And that's it. That's all 75 terms. If you have followed from prenatal development all the way to aging, you now have a strong map of the human lifespan and the major theories psychologists use to explain it. You do not have to memorize everything in one sitting. Simply save this video and come back to the section that you need. If this guide helped you, like the video, subscribe, and share it with someone else who may be studying developmental psychology. And don't forget, the exact slides used in this video are available at thepsychologynotebook.com. The link is down below. And let me know in the comments which topic you would like me to break out next. Thank you for learning with me today, and according to YouTube, this video is perfect for you on your learning journey. Click it and I'll see you over there.